I'd like to thank the Minister for his opening address this morning. I think it sets the scene quite nicely and also takes us down a pathway, I guess, that I was hoping to take us down in this presentation. It's a fairly limited time spot, so I'm not going to dwell on all the amazing programs that are out there, but I will make some general comments around prevention of harm and how we can perhaps do better. But let's get into it. As we've already heard a number of times at this conference, and the Minister's made the same point, most young people will engage in risky behaviours at some stage, but most of them won't end up in the criminal justice system. Those that do come in contact will often disappear again pretty quickly, and that's a good thing. They'll grow out of crime. There's a hardcore set, though, that continue to have an engagement with crime, and I'm going to talk about some of the precursors for that behaviour in this presentation. But first, I prepared a little case study for you to sort of highlight what some kids go through. So this is a case study of an unknown boy. I won't bother naming him. Innocent little chap, or is he an evil genius? This is the question we're going to be answering in a second. At the age of 10, this young fellow was engaged in riding 15, 20 kilometres out of town to visit local quarries to try and hitch rides on the big eucalypt trucks. This young fellow was catching rides to school on the back of cement trains occasionally. This young fellow was using soft drink bottle deposits in the old days to buy cigarettes at the age of 10. So these are sort of some of the behaviours that his parents didn't know about, but which he was engaging in over the course of a few years. Despite appearances, you picked up who it is yet? When I told my mother on some of the stuff I was doing a couple of years ago, which you could just sort of see her wind back the arm, if I hadn't been big enough, I think she was going to flatten me. But yeah, they had no idea what I was up to as a 10-year-old. Now, I grew out of it. At the time I was this age, my risk-taking was abseiling, parachuting, skydiving, whatever. I didn't commit any crimes. I'm certainly not going to admit to any. But like most kids, I did push the boundaries a bit. I did engage in some risk-taking, and then I settled down into what's hopefully described as a decent, law-abiding citizen. I guess others will be the judge, including some of my staff in the audience. Okay. And as we've heard, these days there are just too many young people who are taking that extra step into criminal behaviour, into high-risk activity like binge drinking and drug taking. Now, in the 1980s, a person called Wynne described the myth of the teenage werewolf, the underlying tenet of the myth being that no matter how pleasant, sweet, innocent the child might be at the moment, how amiable and docile and friendly they may be, come the first hormonal surge of puberty, the child turns into an uncontrollable monster. I'm prepared to debate that. Now, these sort of fears, though, they seem quite pervasive at present, and we are seeing a strong attitudinal change in Australia and a number of other Western democracies, such that kids and teenagers are no longer seen as innocents, but are seen as little adults who must take responsibility for their actions. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it means that public sympathy for troubled adolescents has shifted to media-fuelled public support for get-tough approaches, particularly in the area of juvenile justice, and sometimes the sort of more extreme versions of, put kids in boot camps, bring back conscription, etc., etc. Doesn't mean that young people should be allowed to commit crimes, but the attitudes and these attitudes impact on the approaches we take to deal with youth and their risk-taking. If young people are more likely to be perceived in negative terms as a problem group, as a threat to social stability, or as disadvantaged, the resultant policies are more likely, or most likely, to be designed to control, manage and rehabilitate, rather than to encourage and support young people's transition to adulthood. And I'll come back to this point later. In this presentation, I'm going to talk mainly about the adverse impacts of experiencing child abuse and neglect, and also the association with having parental substance abuse in the family and the impacts that can also take. The impact it has on the nature of risk-taking and personal resiliency, the impact it has on taking young people beyond safe boundary testing to problematic behaviour such as committing crime, violent crime in particular, and engaging in substance abuse at ever younger ages. So to set the scene for you, what's the size of the problem? We now have some prevalence data of, if you like, the extent to which child abuse and neglect, or child maltreatment as I'm going to call it here, occur in the Australian population. And in essence what this slide shows us is that between 10 and 20% of Australian kids are estimated to be suffering some form of maltreatment between the ages of birth and 18 years, which is pretty horrendous. It's a big problem, and it's a big influence on young lives. We look at our child protection data, our national statistics, what you find is that in 2009-10 there was 286,000 reports of suspected child abuse and neglect. This has increased by over 1.5 times since 1999-2000. If you go back to when stats first came in back in 1989, 1990, it's about a six times increase. Now, there's a whole range of reasons why that increase is there. This is only the reported stats, but it's still significant. And what we know is that about 1% of Australian kids will be confirmed or substantiated as having experienced child abuse and neglect in 2009-10. So in other words, 35% of those reports were substantiated. And there's been a big increase in substantiation since 1999-2000 as well. We've also got just over 35,000 children in out-of-home care as of June 2010. This has been increasing since 2005. At the moment we have 7 children per 100,000 kids in out-of-home care. Out-of-home care, as I'm sure those who follow the media would know, is often criticised because of the experiences it gives kids who come into care because of abuse concerns aren't always positive. Sometimes it leads kids to take more risk-taking behaviour, to engage in drugs, prostitution, and also to be assaulted or harmed while in care. Now, I can't tell you whether out-of-home care if it is adding to the problem as a whole. The research isn't done. What I can tell you is a lot of the kids who come into care, by definition, already have a lot of problems, and they can be exacerbated by the care experience. Either way, what we've got is kids who are fairly seriously traumatised, and that has impact. We know females more likely than males to be subject of sexual abuse. Males are more likely than females by a small proportion to be subject to physical abuse concerns and substantiations. About 2/3 of children who are substantiated as being harmed across the country are aged less than 10 years. Those most at risk are aged less than 1 year. You might expect that. Newborns, very vulnerable, can't look after themselves. New parents struggling with a new load, with the stresses of being parents in this day and age, and any day and age for that matter. And surprise, surprise, they're vulnerable. As kids get older, the risks are ameliorate a little bit. We also know our Indigenous kids are almost 8 times more likely to be subject to substantiated maltreatment concern. So what are the costs of child abuse and neglect? Well, what we do know is that the short and long-term effects, in which there's a whole range, are more likely if there's a long-term pattern of abuse or neglect, if the abuse or neglect is more severe, and if the concerns aren't addressed. The possible outcomes for kids who've been maltreated can include low self-esteem, depression and suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviour, withdrawn behaviour, anxiety disorders, attachment issues, learning disorders, aggression, violence and acting out, re-victimisation, being physically or sexually assaulted after the initial period of abuse or maltreatment. There can be physical effects such as developmental delays, eating disorders, physical ailments, and of course some engage in delinquency and criminal behaviour. There's also issues with poor school attendance, poor educational outcomes, subsequently poor employment outcomes, increased substance abuse, early pregnancy for females, and also relationship difficulties. So a whole pattern of nasty behaviours. Now, child maltreatment doesn't occur in isolation. The first thing to know is when a child's been sexually abused or physically abused or neglected or emotionally abused, often they're experiencing other forms of maltreatment at the same time. Sexual abuse and neglect go together, physical abuse and emotional abuse go together. So there's a whole range of negative behaviours a child can experience, and that doesn't occur in isolation either. We look at other key factors you find with a lot of maltreatment. What you find is the presence of domestic violence. You find the presence of a history of childhood abuse. The parents have been abused themselves or neglected themselves. You find poverty in a toxic environment, social isolation, lack of supports, substance abuse, parental substance abuse is often common, and mental illness, parental mental illness or intellectual disability, and sometimes a child's intellectual disability or mental illness as well. Now, the ones in red, family violence, substance abuse, mental illness or intellectual disability, are the 3 main factors that you find leading to the increased reports of child maltreatment concerns in this country. It is a significant issue. And some of these things also are associated, as the Minister said, with families who are committing other crimes that aren't related to child abuse and neglect at all. So what's some of the pathway from child maltreatment to juvenile offending? We've actually got some pretty good evidence here. Kathy Whiteham's been looking at this issue now for well over 2 decades, and in a recent study she tracked 1,500 cases over 25 years in America from childhood to adulthood and compared the arrest records of 908 substantiated victims of child maltreatment against 667 kids who weren't victims but who were matched on a range of demographics. What she found was the maltreated kids were 30% more likely to be arrested for violent crime later in life. And one of the things I guess I'd probably make the point right now is that just because you're maltreated doesn't mean you're going to go on to commit crimes or have all of these range of negative effects, but doesn't help your chances. There is an increased risk from having these experiences that we have to work on, we have to address. In recent Australian work, Anna Stewart and a team from Queensland studied a cohort of children born in 1983-84 who had contact with the child protection system, and what she found and her team found was that school transitions were important times when children are more likely to experience maltreatment. This could be because the families were more likely to come in contact with professionals who would make reports because of concerns they observed, or because the stress of changing schools, the stress of different life stages was actually leading to more maltreatment. She also found that kids whose maltreatment trajectories started or continued into adolescence were more likely to offend. It probably makes a bit of sense if you think about it. The young kids who experience a pattern of abuse over time are going to have more issues to deal with, including the potential for offending later on. What was a little bit surprising to me was that those who started being maltreated in adolescence, there was also impact. In fact, it was actually more significant in some ways in terms of their likelihood to offend. And what Anna and colleagues found was that 26% of the maltreated children went on to offend, compared with 17% of children who weren't maltreated and 20% of children who had a not substantiated notification. So what that really means is the family probably had some concerns, but Child Protection Services didn't think there was confirmation, if you like, of maltreatment occurring. Now, these figures are pretty high. 26% of kids of this particular sample committing offences. 17% of kids who weren't maltreated committing offences, and I think the issue was they matched these kids on demographics, and the reality is, like it or not, that often we get a preponderance of these of negative factors around low SES, high dysfunctional neighbourhoods, and what you're getting is a range of, if you like, other causes which are leading to a relatively high crime rate as well. So the significant predictors of offending were firstly gender. Males are more likely to offend, we know this. Indigenous status, Indigenous children are more likely to offend. In fact, by the time they were 17, more than half of the maltreated Indigenous males had gone on to offend. That's a horrendous figure. The timing of the final maltreatment incident, if you're still being abused in adolescence, you're more likely to offend. If you experience a large number of notifications and maltreatment incidents, by definition you've had a hard time, a difficult time, a traumatic time, you're more likely to offend. And if you experience physical abuse or neglect rather than, say, sexual abuse or emotional abuse, you're more likely to offend. Another amazing piece of Australian research conducted here in Melbourne at Monash University tracked outcomes for 2,700 children who were sexually abused between 1967 and 1995, and compared that with a control group of kids, and what they found was that sexual abuse survivors had three times more contact with mental health agencies. Those abused between 12 and 16 years had a greater risk for psychopathology, and the suicide rate was 19 times higher in the sexual abuse cohort. The figures are still, the suicide rates are actually relatively low for what the experiences they've had, but they're still much higher if you've been maltreated. They took a subsample to look at offending issues from the overall study, and they found that almost 35% of the sexually abused cohort committed an offence, compared with 6.8% of the control group. They also found the age at onset of offending when you've been sexually abused in this cohort was 16 years compared with 26 years. So those who'd been maltreated were offending 10 years earlier, when they're still immature, at an earlier stage in their life. That's a pretty significant finding. It has implications for interventions. They also found that 9.4% of the abused males committed sexual offences, compared with 0.7% in the control. And that those who were abused themselves over the age of 12 years committed many more offences than those who were abused prior to the age of 12 years.